Hello, BookTube. I wanted to do a quick introductory video here about book reviewing. Not only because it's been a while since I made my last overview video about book reviewing, but also because we live in an age where we have more book reviewers than we've ever had before. Readers tend to review their books now in a way that once upon a time they did not. Once upon a time, the closest that the average reader would come to giving anything resembling the review of a book that they just finished, whether it was an old title or a new title, would be to chat about it a little with their librarian before they move on to the next book. But a written review, now tens of thousands of people do that on a regular basis on sites like Amazon and Goodreads, and whole communities build up around that. So it seems like a perennially interesting, important subject, something that a lot of people are engaged in. And I thought I might make another quick book reviewing 101 video just to add my own thoughts to the equation, since I have been involved with book reviewing for a very, very long time. I am myself a professional book reviewer. I don't do anything else. And there aren't many of us left in the world, and none of the rest of us are on BookTube. So I thought I would run down 10 points about book reviewing, 10 basic points about book reviewing. We'll split them up 5 and 5. So the first 5 things that we're going to talk about in this video, which I'm hoping won't go long, deal with the review itself. And the first of those is very basic. These will be very basic things. The very first thing to deal with the review itself is you should describe the book to your readers. I know that sounds very simple, but you'd be amazed, or maybe you wouldn't be if you read a lot of Amazon reviews or a lot of Goodreads reviews. You'd be amazed how many reviewers forget to do that. You need to introduce the book to your reader as if they've never heard of it before, and that holds true even if it's a long anticipated book or a book that everybody's talking about. You still have to introduce the book, and you have to introduce the author. You have to introduce not only the world of the book, but also the world of the book's subject, especially if it's nonfiction, but even if it's fiction. You need to situate your reader when it comes to the book. They should not have to go elsewhere from your review to know what you're talking about. Pretty simple, but we can start off that way. Another thing about the review itself is that you should remember that a book review is not a book report. You should remember to give a sense of the reading experience of the book to your reader. Your reader has not read the book. They're going to want to know what it's like. They're going to want to know what happens next. They're going to want to know what's in it. But they're also going to want to know what it's like to read it. Now, large elements of that are subjective, so it'll be tricky to write about that in a review, since a review shouldn't have a review shouldn't be trafficking much in subjectivity. Nevertheless, you want to give a sense of what the book itself is like. Now, a large part of that is going to be the fact that you will describe it, but you should also quote from it. You should give the book a chance to talk to the reader itself directly. Not only because that's only fair, but also because that can change the reading experience. I don't know if it's ever happened to you, but it's happened to me many, many times that I'll be reading a book review in, the Pocono Press or the New York Times. And the author will be railing on about its defects, and then they will quote from it, and I will detect none of those defects. I've lost count of the number of times that I've actually decided to read a book based on the quotes in a review that was telling me not to. So that's important to do. And when we're talking about the element of subjectivity, we can move on to our third point, which is that you should assess your reactions to the book. You should convey your reactions to the book in addition to your evaluations of the book. You could, for instance, be assigned, commissioned to review a 1,000-page new history of the bubonic plague, the Black Death. Well, a large part of your review of that book is going to be about what's in the book, Most of your readers are going to want to know that. Why is this better than the last two books on global histories of the pandemic? Why is this any different than them? What kind of sources does the author use? Or maybe even more importantly, what kind of sources does the author ignore? Right? So evaluating the book in a case like that, but I would argue it's largely the same in a novel as well, is going to be very important. But you also want to convey your reactions to it. Again, that's going to be difficult because you individually as a person don't have any place in a book review. I know that's anathema in the 21st century, flies in the face of the Twitter worldview, but nevertheless, you don't have any place in a book review. It's written by you and it's entirely you, but bringing things down to the narrow focus of, well, I just didn't like it, renders your review almost useless. I'm sure that you've encountered reviews like that yourself on Amazon or Goodreads. Lord knows I have, where I will find some book on Goodreads. I will go to the number one, the first review, and the reviewer will say, don't really like books like this. Can't really say why. Could go into it, don't really have the time. And it's probably 10 sentences of crap like that before you get to anything evaluative. So, and my response when I read things like that is, I don't care at all. I couldn't care less who you are. Nevertheless, aside from, just straight up solipsism like that, there are ways to convey what the reading experience is like apart from the evaluation. Take the example that I used about that 1,000-page book about the bubonic plague. You are going to want to evaluate what that book does, how it does things, how many original source languages are in the bibliography, for instance, or I guess in the 21st century, does it have a bibliography? In other words, you're going to want to evaluate the extent of the author's research, how well they know their subject. You're going to want to evaluate in terms of their book and also in terms of their book's relationship to the body of literature about that subject. But is that 1,000-page book also boring? Whether it covers all the information or not, whether it has the most impressive bibliography on God's green earth or not, is it boring? Or, obversely, is it really exciting to read and has barely anything in the way of sources? Maybe they're all links to Wikipedia. That might not damn it, but you'd want to convey that. You'd want to convey the reading experience as well. And then the fourth point for reviews themselves is, again, going to be tricky in the 21st century where everyone is connected to everyone else. It's not 6 degrees of separation anymore. You're 1 degree of separation from anyone in the world. Despite that fact, I want to stress that when you're writing a review, you should not spare a single thought in the world for the author of the book. Not a single thought at all. Your review is not a dialogue with the author. Your review is not an entree to get to know that author. Your review is not anything like that. You should not spare a thought for them at all. Not at all. Your whole duty when you're writing a review is to your readers, not to the author of the book. They all lie anyway. They all claim anyway that they don't read reviews. Well, take them at their word. They're lying, but take them at their word that they're not even one of your readers. So your duty is to the people who are reading your reviews. Don't think about the author. Don't think for a minute when you're writing a review, well, I don't know, this is kind of, the author might not like this. Reading, this is a negative review. If it's this negative, maybe it'll ruin the author's day. No one cares about the author's day. No one. You shouldn't care about the author's day. What you are, what I am in my book reviews is a junkyard dog. And you want me to make as much noise and be as unpleasant as possible if the intruder, in this case the book, is bad, has evil intent, is going to steal from you your time, your attention, or your money. You want that. In my opinion, you want that in a review. If I read a book review, again, from the, the St. Petersburg Picayune all the way up to the New York Times book review, if I read a review and I think that the writer of the review is having a cuddly kind of talk with the author that I get to eavesdrop on, I drop the review. I don't even finish reading it. It's completely worthless to me. You want to do that sort of thing? Manage to get commission to interview the author for the Paris Review. There you go. Then you'll be fine. I ignore those anyway. But a review? You're assessing the work. You're evaluating the work. It has nothing to do with the author. The author has sent their book out into the world. They didn't want to have their day ruined by having someone point out that the state of affairs on page 13 radically contradicts the state of affairs on page 67. They should have kept the book at home. When you put it out in the world, that's what you're doing. You're running that risk. Remember that when you're reviewing the book. Don't think about the author at all. They're not involved anymore. And the fifth point about the review itself is to remember that book reviewing is a kind of writing on its own. This is not actually a book report. This is a kind of writing. It's a genre of writing on its own, which means you should shape it. It should be entertaining. It should be well written. You should not be relying on cliches or lazy idioms of any kind. It should be worked over to express your voice in an entertaining and instructive way. Now, there'll be some limitations placed on that by the next 5 things that we're going to talk about, which is the reviewing world, the actual process of putting a review out in the world. There'll be some aspects of that that may be curtailed. If, for instance, you have a commissioned book review, if you're writing a book review for someone else, either for the notoriety and the clout of their venue or for money or for both, well, if that's true, then you're going to have an editor. And an editor may impede your ability to write a book review that is itself an outstanding piece of writing with your name on it. We'll get to that in the next 5 points. But I want to point out for this one that I would say, probably 90% of the book reviews that get written in any given year are no longer commissioned by anyone. Goodreads doesn't interfere with what your review is. A Storygraph doesn't interfere with what your review says. They ask you, most places, most general places like that, or Amazon or whatever, will ask you to hide spoilers so that your review isn't ruining the experience of a spoiler for some other reader. But they won't say, I don't know if this is phrased right. They won't do anything like that kind of editorial crap. I would say that's 90% of the reviews that get written in a year, which means that 90% of the people who are doing this don't have the excuse of saying, well, my editor tamed that or toned that down or whatever. 90% of you should remember that a book review is a piece of writing with your name on it. You are not covering all the bases if all you do is describe, assess, and evaluate the book. The writing also has to be good. You have to work on that aspect of it as well. But we'll move on to the process of reviewing. And for the process of reviewing, I have 5 more points, and I want to sort of stress here that these are mostly for commissioned work, for work where you are dealing with an editor, where you're not just posting it on your Goodreads page. Because that's a goal, right? It doesn't necessarily have to be your goal, but it's a goal. If you post a review of novel X, Y, or Z on Goodreads, it's going to get a lot of traffic. A lot of people are going to see it. Anybody who's looking for a review of that work is going to come across your review. They're going to type it into Goodreads, like a lot of people do, or if you post your review on Amazon, even more people do. And that's reach, but it's scattershot, and you never know about it. Whereas if you are commissioned to write a review for a venue, whether it's an online venue or an old-style dinosaur newsprint paper, there's going to be a reach there. Sometimes it's going to be a much greater reach, and it's going to be very focused. You're going to know what your reach is. That's pretty valuable. So it's a goal. I would say that if you like writing book reviews, you should try your hand at that goal, and we will get to that. But thing number 1 about these 5 points about the book reviewing process. Review number 1 is contour your work to your venue. Don't think you are going to be the exception. I know that, again, this contravenes the attitudes of the 21st century, where we are all the Messiah. We are all the single individual that all of history has been groaning in expectation of. That is the attitude now that every school child is taught. If your teacher doesn't talk to you and treat you like you are the actual coming of the Messiah, we'll sue them. We'll make sure they never work again. They won't even bag groceries. That we want them to treat you that way. Nevertheless, you're not. And so when you go to a venue, take a look at that venue If that venue only publishes 800-word book reviews, don't send them a 3,000-word review. Don't even send it to them. Don't waste the editor's time in needing to tell you that 2,200 words of this thing has to go. And, oh my God, if, let's say, you do that, you shouldn't do that. That is totally preventable. But if you do that, if you send a 3,000-word review to a place that writes newspaper reviews, basically 500 to 800 words, if you send that to them and an editor actually makes the time to write back to you and say, well, I'm sorry, but this is 2,200 words too long. If you cut it down to 800 words, feel free to resend it. If an editor actually takes the time to do that, kindly don't write them back and say, but I really think that it deserves to be this long. Well, you can do that if you want, but you'll never get work with that editor again, or anyone that editor has drinks with. Don't do it. Contour your work to the review, to the venue. This applies even if you don't have an editor, right? Don't give a book 6 stars on Goodreads. The Goodreads venue gives you 5 stars, up to 5 stars, so don't do that. Don't load your review with profanity, for instance, if the venue doesn't accept that, as most of them don't. Don't think that you are the star of the show and can rewrite the rules. If you are looking to latch onto that venue's greater reach, greater focused reach, you have to pay the price for that. One of the ways to pay the price for that is to contour your work to the venue, and that way is non-negotiable. So do it. Then when we're talking about writing for a venue, here we're talking about writing for a venue where you have an editor, where you aren't in complete control of the process. Usually when you're doing that, you need to pitch a review to an editor. You need to let them know that you're out there and that such and such a book is out there and that you would like to review such and such a book for them. You have to let them know that that's true. All of that is true. That means that you have to pitch your review to an editor. So you have to write them a brief email. I stress brief. Oh my God, I stress brief. Your pitch email should be 3 sentences long, not 3 paragraphs long. 3 sentences long. It should be easy to read. An editor should be able to get it in one visual snapshot. They shouldn't need to read War and Peace. Do it. And that's my second piece of advice here is don't put your whole book review in your pitch to an editor. I know that it's unromantic, and I know that especially new writers don't like to know it or don't like to think it, but your editor will know in literally a nanosecond whether or not they want the review that you're pitching. They'll know in a nanosecond. I know that the romantic idea is that they'll ponder and they'll go out over lunch and I don't know, this could be important. No, they'll know in 2 seconds. They'll know in 2 seconds whether or not they want it. And it's the luck of the draw. It's the editor's jar. It's their page. It's their venue. It's their vision. So they'll know what they want and don't want. There is almost no way to successfully argue your way past that. And there's almost no safe way to try. An editor's not going to like being strong-armed. And, oh my God, definitely they're not going to like being guilted. Well, I really think this is an important subject. I'm kind of surprised that you don't think it's an important subject. You cannot bully an editor. They are in their position because you cannot bully them. So don't try. Don't try. Especially if you want to keep doing it. You can try it the one time if you get that, that Twitter dopamine hit, but that editor will never take work from you again. So don't do it. But the point I'm trying to make here is don't put your whole review in your pitch. Don't go on forever and ever about this is culturally important and here's the history of this in a brief, i.e. 1,000-word paragraph. And here's what I'm thinking of exploring. Especially don't do that if you're pitching to a newspaper type venue. Place that's going to give you 500 to 800 words. You're not going to be doing any exploring in 500 to 800 words anyway. So you're writing yourself right out of the picture there. You're contradicting point number 1 if you do that. Instead, your pitch should be so-and-so, who you might remember from such and such a book, has a new book coming out on such and such a subject. Looks really good. I would love to review it for you. That's basically all it needs to be. Believe it or not, and I know a lot of new writers don't like to believe it, no editor's going to need more than that. They're going to look at that and think, yes, I do want to cover that book. I'll take a chance on you because I don't have anyone else to do it. A lot of times they'll look at that and say, I do want to cover that book and I have someone else to do it. In a situation like that, most editors who like to think of themselves as the most overworked creatures on God's green earth, I don't know why, and I don't know when that started, but they like to think of themselves as just monumentally overworked. So a lot of them will think that it is perfectly socially acceptable to look at that pitch, even if it is brief, even if you've done everything right, think, yeah, I do want to cover that, but I have someone else to do it. A lot of editors will think that it's socially acceptable once they've realized that to simply not respond to you at all. They won't respond even with a half sentence telling you, already have someone, try again. They won't even do that. It'll just be silence, as one editor put it, unbelievably to me, even in the 20th century, unbelievably. One editor actually said in public that no response, no reply is the new not interested. That is absolutely not true. No reply is monstrously rude. You are going to encounter it, though. So all the better if you don't write a doctoral dissertation in your pitch. They'll know right away. The good editors will let you know. I already have someone for this. I'm not interested in this particular book, but what about something like that? Good ones will respond. Most of them won't, especially the higher up the food chain you go of the venue. And in that regard, I'm outraged. I'm as outraged by it as you are, but I have to tell you, you're not going to like hearing it. Getting back to them isn't going to help. As I'm sure that your mother or grandmother told you when you were a lot younger, you can't make someone have good manners. So if you write a pitch to an editor, even if you've behaved yourself and the pitch is lightning fast and right to the point, and they don't respond at all, not with a not interested, just not at all, just total silence, writing them again 3 weeks later and saying, just circling back, or I wonder if you saw that email, writing them back probably isn't going to do anything. If they're rude, they're rude. So if they've got a persecution complex, then it's going to stay there. But when we get to, let's say you do get commissioned to write a review from somebody, and you want a hook for the review, which is a very common thing, right? It's what separates a book report from a book review, is that the book review is a piece of writing on its own, like we mentioned. One of the most popular hooks that people like to use is one that I would like to urge you not to use, which is to hook with some piece of current news. I would argue not to do that unless the author of the book you're reviewing is actually doing that, in which case you're going to have to. But even then, even when circumstances of reviewing the book seem to require it, I would still evaluate it. Take a big step back. Try to make your review timeless, is what I'm saying. Try to make it timeless. The more you say, let's say you're writing a review of... I don't even know. Well, let's say American politics. Just broadly speaking, American politics. And you want to kick off your review by saying, well, given the chaos in the U.S. House of Representatives in this last week, is it all that surprising that the United States politics is usually typified by indecision? No one's going to know what you mean. In a year, no one's going to remember what you mean. In 10 years, no one's going to have any idea. It's going to need a footnote. It's weak writing. So I would urge you not to do it unless the writer of the book is writing about something ripped from the headlines. And even then, take a step back. Try a little. I know that the newspaper reviews especially have been characterized for centuries as being the kind of thing that is read by a handful of people on Monday morning and is wrapping fish on Tuesday morning or lining the birdcage on Tuesday morning. And that is largely true, but that doesn't mean you have to give up the fight. Try to write for all time. Try a little bit to write for all time. There's no harm in that. We have the internet now. So it's possible that you are writing for all time. It's possible that the internet never forgets. So that's point number 3 here is tone down the topicality as much as you can. It might seem very plugged in, and book reviewers tend to be book nerds. They tend to be bookworms, and bookworms always feel like they are always flashing back to their years in high school when they were the scorned and despised outsiders of the cool kids club. And one of the ways that most of those nerds tried to buy their way into that club was by being right on the cutting edge of all the gossip. Hey guys, if you let me sit at your table, I'll tell you all the stuff I just learned about so-and-so. That attitude sticks around over decades and becomes the nerdy, pushing up the glasses book reviewer who wants to make the review really cool by being all cutting edge. Don't do that. Don't do that. Try not to do that. Try to write for all ages. Then, Point number 4 is very simple. I've gone over it in other book reviewing videos of mine, and that is don't miss your deadline. For any reason whatsoever, under any conceivable circumstances, ever, even once. Don't miss your deadline. If you get a deadline from an editor and it's punitive or it won't work in some way, you can certainly write to that editor and say, is there any chance that we could extend this deadline by a week? Any chance that we could do that? That's perfectly fine. But a lot of editors are looking at a grid. They're looking at a calendar. And they're laying out their content, especially if they do daily content. Oh my God. But even if not, even if they're looking at some big production number, they're looking at a grid. And they're filling in spaces. They're coloring in spaces. So deadlines matter. If you ask a reviewer, an editor, this deadline is really, it just doesn't work, but maybe 3 days later, 4 days later, something like that, would that work? Fine. A lot of them will do, that'll be acceptable to a lot of editors, and that's fine. But simply missing a deadline, having the editor say, all right, I want this piece from you. We've worked out a fee, $450. I want this piece from you. I want it at such and such a length. I'm having the book sent to you. I'd like the review by the 17th of next month. And you say yes, and you get the book, and you mark it all up, and then the 17th rolls around and you miss the deadline. A fawning or begging email to an editor on that day is not going to help that editor at all. All it's going to help them do is cross your name off a list. That's all. It's going to wreak havoc with what they do. So don't do it. And then point number 5 here for the section of this video about the book reviewing process, not the review, but the reviewing process, is don't argue with your editor. Like I mentioned, it's the editor's show. It's their page, it's their section, it's their website. They know what they want. Now, you might not like what you see, in which case I would argue that you shouldn't pitch to them at all. But you might not agree. You might think they're timid or voyeuristic or way too topical themselves. Nevertheless, you're not going to change that, so don't argue with it. It's their show, so they get what they want, and it's up to you to decide your own personal dividing line of what's acceptable and what's not. If you submit a review to an editor and they fiddle with it a little, and then they send it back to you and say, could you fix these things? I've made notes on this. Could you fix these things? Your typical answer should be an immediate yes, and you should turn that work around right away. Don't put it on the back burner and say that you'll get to it, because you won't. You should turn that work around right away. That editor should get your edits back in an hour, 2 hours. Now, granted, that will take a lot longer if it's an Atlantic Monthly or a Vanity Fair piece where the edits will be extensive and require large amounts of work on your part. But you'll be being compensated for that work. I'm mostly focusing here on short-form newspaper-type reviews, 500 to 800, 1,000 words, where an editor's notes will be along the lines of, this isn't clear, or this repeats itself. Little notes like that. You get something like that, that's perfectly acceptable. Turn those around right away and be done with it. If an editor does more than that, if you submit a review to them and they write back and say, well, the narrative doesn't flow here, can we rearrange this, or can you shift the emphasis here? Essentially, can you rewrite the work? You have to decide for yourself what the dividing line is of what you're willing to do and what you're willing not to do. A smaller venue, newspaper-type editor is not going to offer you any extra compensation for doing those edits. The fee that you agreed on originally is going to be the one you get. But it could be that the editor is doubling or even tripling the amount of work that you're doing on that same piece for the same amount of money. You have to decide how much of that is acceptable. Most people just grin and bear it, because most editors aren't that bad. But that's up to you. And then there's a more serious and a larger issue, which is if an editor fiddles with your work without sending it back to you. If you submit a review, an editor says, thanks, looks great, and then it runs, and you notice that it's been fiddled with. That phrases have been dropped. That's the least offensive thing. Or that phrases have been moved around. Or that prose has been added. Without ever a word to you from the editor beforehand. Where some editors, I hate to say it, but it's true, some editors view the review that you send them as raw material. Like you were sending them on just bolts of cloth. And they have to stitch it together into a review. That is absolutely not true. That is absolutely not true. You are a writer. You are a professional in your own right. No editor should think that about a piece of writing that you're submitting to them, but plenty of them do. And again, if that happens, the decision is yours what to do. If a review runs and you notice that it's been fiddled with, a brief, all communications with editors should be brief, a brief letter to the editor saying, I noticed that you changed a lot of the review before you ran it. That's okay, but I'd really appreciate it if you would let me make those changes in the future. Most editors will listen to that. Most of them will agree with that. Some will even be human enough still to be abashed by having that mentioned to them. If the opposite happens, if the editor fiddles with your work, changes a lot of your work, and then sends it back to you to say, could you look over this? A lot of times editors will send you, for instance, the finalized PDF of your work that is what viewers are going to see in the print version. A lot of times they'll send that to you and they'll say, could you look this over and see if it's okay? They're expecting you to write back with an absolute rubber stamp pro forma, looks fine to me. But if you read it and it's more their work than yours, you have to decide in that moment how valuable that is to you. You can either say yes and let it go, let it run, let everybody read it that way, and hope for a better, more equitable working relationship with that editor down the line by paying dues in that way. Or you can say, no, this is not acceptable. You've drastically changed my work. You've added a huge amount of writing to what I sent you without my consent. So no, it's not acceptable to me. A good editor will have a piece to put in that place if something goes wrong and they can't run yours. And that's not the same thing as missing a deadline, right? That's something that was done to your work. You didn't know that it was happening, and you're perfectly within your rights to say, no, you cannot run this version. I'm not a prima donna. I'm not saying that you can't touch any of the words that I wrote to you, but you've substantially changed them and you haven't told me about it. So you'd be running work that isn't mine. I wouldn't be able to point to it in any way. I wouldn't be able to say that it's mine. I would have to tell people who said good job in the Cleveland Dispatch that the first two paragraphs aren't mine. You have to decide what you will do there. If for some reason a piece that you've been commissioned to write has to be killed, most places will offer you a kill fee. It won't be the whole fee that you agreed on, but it will be usually 3/4 of that fee. If, for instance, the editor can't run it, they lose the space or whatever, double assign it or something, or they'll usually give you a kill fee for that. But if you insist that the piece be pulled for reasons that don't have anything to do with you, you could ask for a kill fee then too, although if you do that, you'll probably never get any work from that editor again. I know it's not fair, but it's true. So those are 5 points about the reviewing process itself. There are all sorts of pros and cons, all sorts of compromises, that sort of thing that you usually have to do. And a lot of times those compromises will increase as the stature of the venue that you're pitching to increases. It's only very rarely that a reviewer will send a review to the Boston Globe or the Washington Post or whatever, and it'll run word for word as they wrote it. That doesn't happen that often. It does sometimes happen, but it doesn't happen that often. So you have to expect a little bit of that give and take, provided you play by the rules. Observe the outlines of the venue. Respect the final say of your editor. Don't miss your deadline. If you're playing by the rules, then you will have some fungible decisions to make about what's acceptable and what's not, that you don't have to face on sites like Amazon or Goodreads, or if you have a literary blog of your own. And along those lines, I want to end this Book Reviewing 101 by pointing out that I am the editor of an online literary journal called Open Letters Review. I'm one of the editors on the masthead. Some of the other names on the masthead you will recognize if you're a part of BookTube, for instance. And we run reviews of new releases, and you are perfectly happy. You are encouraged to submit a review. You can send it to me at the email that I leave on every video, or you can submit it to Open Letters through the Open Letters website. The editorial process at Open Letters Review is fairly hands-off. I expect everyone to be an adult. I expect everyone to play like an adult. If you observe the rules, we don't have any deadlines at Open Letters Review, for instance. The book has to be new. That's it. And we do have venue limitations. The reviews are never much longer than 1,000 words, and the book has to be new. And there's a house style. It's basically a newspaper type style. You have to quote from the book. You have to describe the book. It can't be a kind of Hunter S. Thompson surreal first person gonzo journalism type thing. It can't be anything like that. It's got to be a straightforward newspaper style book review. If you're willing to do that, if you're willing to abide by that, I am perfectly happy to help you. Hone your stuff, work your stuff, build up a body of published work in Open Letters Review that will be a sufficient springboard to other venues. I have no illusions about the size or the pull of Open Letters Review. It is a small, free, online literary journal. Nevertheless, people do use it as a springboard to other places. So I encourage you to do that. That way you can learn all of these 101 tips firsthand in a way that, for all that I love them, sites like Amazon and Goodreads won't do. So there you go. There is Book Reviewing 101. That is half about the review itself and half about the reviewing process. Just because the videos that I made on this subject have been buried in the videos of yesteryear, so I thought I would keep it fresh for 2023. So I'll wrap this up for now, and I'll be back. Thank you, BookTube.